Good morning, everybody. How are you doing? I hope you're well and happy. I'm very well. Thank you very much. Just had some Tai Chi and some yoga, so I'm feeling very zen. I'm recording through Zoom again because I wanted to remind everyone of this particularly choice image. Thank you to the Daily Telegraph for this. Um, I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves in this kind of current moment of Jeffrey Epstein that I don't know, certain revelations like this seem to consistently come out quite a lot. And I think this ties in with a lot of what I'm talking about in this week's blog, which is actually about politics. Who would have thought? I mean, anyway, so I'm going to get into the blog here, and it's called Mesotopia Towards a Politics of Partial Revelation. Okay. One of the quietly awkward things about object-oriented ontology, OOO, is watching very clever people try to prise a politics out of it without breaking the crockery. Graham Harman tends to sidestep the issue, while Timothy Morton leans into it with a kind of earnest bravado. Morton's move toward eco-Gnosticism and the attempt to locate this within a Marxist framework in texts like Humankind is genuinely interesting. However, it also feels slightly misaligned. Classic Marxism is grounded in class analysis, historically specific struggles, and the evaluation of material and economic exploitation. OOO, by contrast, flattens the ontological field. Everything withdraws. Everything is weird. The risk is that a politics emerging from OOO may be interpreted less as a material project and more as a kind of nihilistic mood that risks favoring apathy over engagement. I'm just going to interject there to unpack some of what I'm talking about here. So during my research, I kept returning to object-oriented ontology because it really kind of articulated the process of meaning making that I was undertaking, right? So it really helped me understand the relationship between the environment, the body, and the mind working together to create meaning. But then the problem with that, of course, is when you start to think about political projects emerging from that kind of interaction, well, then you can get into some very strange territory very quickly because it's not really kind of conducive with many, shall we say, progressive or I don't even know, or many political projects. Let's just say that, because I mean, progressive is a weird term itself because that could mean progressing towards what, right? So again, we're getting into the elements of utopian thinking here, which underpins a lot of politics. And as I expressly set out here, I use the language of utopia to critique these things, hence the term mesotopia. Anyway, back to the blog. I explore this tension more fully in my thesis, Mesotopia Towards a Place of Lyrical Inquiry. But the short version is this. I admire the effort to push OOO into the political sphere, even when I don't think it quite lands. And that misfiring is instructive because it reveals something important about knowledge itself. While researching the mechanics of Mesotopian meaning making, it became increasingly obvious to me that all research, no matter how rigorous, eventually arrives at a moment of pure conjecture. There is always a moment where the evidence runs out and interpretation takes over. Mesotopia names this space. I live here, we all do, whether we admit it or not. It is a state of partial revelation. And I think that's quite important to get into there. So I looked at specifically people like Harman and Morton, Graham Harman and Timothy Morton, while I was doing my research, and noticed like whenever they did try to sort of get into political terrains, it felt a little bit awkward. Although I would say Harman's immaterialism, where he kind of looks at the European colonial project. While clunky, I think that that has some very interesting ideas in it. I found Humankind a little bit strange. Again, with Stenger's versions of this, or, Isabel Stenger's, like sometimes it can feel a bit kind of, well, again, it kind of gets into utopian thinking in certain ways. And I don't know if that's necessarily that constructive or helpful. Anyway, back to the blog. So this idea of partial revelation is something that came out of my research where I was thinking, okay, well, I need the environment, the body, and the mind in order to make meaning of my reality. Okay, so it's this interplay between the environment, the body, and the mind. That's the psy-omatics element of my research. So if you're thinking about that, that meaning is reliant on these things, what is the political reality that emerges from that? And I would suggest that I live in an environment or interact with an environment where I do not understand everything about the environment. And we all do, right? We're all kind of going through life in this sort of, know certain things, but we certainly don't know an awful lot of things, right, about the environment in which we exist. Therefore, that extends to our political reality. And I go on to talk about this in this particular blog and introduce this as an idea. So, back to the blog. This is not as exotic as it sounds. In fact, it has deep resonances with classic Marxism and even elements of Maoism, where political life is understood to be structurally occluded. Much is withheld, not necessarily because it is illegal, but because it would be politically embarrassing, destabilizing, or simply inconvenient if widely known. The very existence of scandals that sit at the periphery of respectable political discourse, such as Operation Gladio or Jeffrey Epstein, points to this condition. Power does not announce itself clearly. Decisions are made elsewhere, in rooms you and I, dear reader, are not invited into, using codes and languages we've not been taught to speak. And I just want to interject there. And I think that that is something we all need to really acknowledge at this particular time. Sure, speculation isn't helpful either, but we have to accept and we have to acknowledge that our political reality is one of partial revelation. And the more that I've traveled, the more that I've come to understand certain things about liberal institutions is that specifically we don't know everything. And I don't necessarily know why we don't know everything, or why things are occluded, or why things are hidden, or why PR, vast amounts of money is invested in PR and propaganda to not inform the public about certain things. And we have to question that. And I think we have to be very real about what that means to our understanding of where we live. All right, back to the blog. My own experiences of working at the fringes of empire have only reinforced my thinking here. I do not know the truth of political machinations at the highest level, but I do know with absolute certainty that the general public does not know everything either. This isn't paranoia, it isn't fear, it's political realism. Okay, and I want to inject there. So I've also worked with media institutions and academic institutions too. So even though I don't know for certain all of these things, I do have some awareness that things are kind of manipulated or changed for general public consumption, right? And I don't necessarily have the answers for that, but I know something is definitely wrong there. Anyway, back to the blog. Often in my research, I return to old-fashioned historical materialist strategies, following the flows of money, mapping institutional relationships, noting who funds whom and why. These methods can clarify motivations and alliances that otherwise seem baffling. However, they do not constitute conclusive proof of wrongdoing. Many financial arrangements are perfectly legal. They're simply hidden because they don't look good under fluorescent light. Just going to interject there. So the other week I was talking about researching London Pride and how that kind of unsettled me so much that we put loads of work into Margate Pride. It's not necessarily that London Pride is doing anything illegal. They're not. It's just, it looks grimy when you start to pull apart those relationships and you think, oh, okay, so these people are just funding this to make their own interests look good, and there's huge amounts of money going through here. It just doesn't feel authentic in any way. And I think all of us kind of understand that about many of our relationships, including, yes, my encounters with the Celtic language and Celtic nationalist movements around the UK. I've got serious questions about who is motivating that and why. And I don't know. Anyway, back to the blog. This is why I found Erik Davis's approach in High Weirdness so refreshing. Davis manages to acknowledge the unknown, the speculative, and the unresolved without sliding into mockery or credulity. He takes uncertainty seriously. Again, I'll interject there. This text, High Weirdness, is really interesting. It comes out of a sort of a literary criticism. You know, he's looking at the literature, weird literature of kind of 60s and 70s, particularly in places like coming out of California or that sort of scene. And then he's going into, he uses that as a tool to really look at a lot of these kind of esoteric and weird and new agey movements that came out of California in the 70s. And I think it's really interesting because he doesn't like sort of just call these things crank. You know, he kind of takes it seriously, and I think that's what we need to start doing a bit more of, really. Back to the blog. I encountered something similar while researching the Cornish language. I plotted the publishing output of writers who have subtly pushed narratives of Baltic and Celtic nationalisms and arrived at a moment of conjecture. Why are they doing this? I also didn't understand why certain groups of people attended some Celtic language meetings. I still don't. I will never know the inner motives of esoteric groups. Mesotopia teaches me to live with that, not as resignation, but as orientation. Not knowing is not a failure. It is the condition of political life. However, this does not mean that we simply accept not knowing as a reason for not doing. On the contrary, I suggest that a politics of partial revelation encourages us to continue to participate in a project to attend to our local environments, even though we cannot possibly know everything. And I'm just going to quickly interject there. Yes, this is really important. During the Mesotopian event and my Mesotopian research, I am interacting with the environment as well, right? I'm participating in meaning making, right? Therefore, it is not kind of, apathy. I'm not just allowing the political reality to unfold around me with not participating in it. And I that's something I want to stress. I don't want this to slip into kind of like nihilistic apathy of like, well, it's always been like this, we can't change it. No, I definitely think that we can certainly name this and say, I don't actually understand why this is happening. However, I know that it's probably not happening in my interests, right? Okay, back to the blog. And this is an important line that I write here. I can state what I know and intuit what I don't. I can state what I know and intuit what I don't, meaning I can just tell you, I know this, I know this, I know this, and I don't know why this is happening. All right, back to the blog. From my research, I observed that industrialists, financiers, and right-wing factions often push nationalist narratives to appeal to the sensibilities of certain minority groups. For what ultimate reason, I cannot know. My intuition, however, is to remain skeptical of their intentions. Partial revelation is the rule, not the exception, and politics begins not with certainty, but with the refusal to be paralyzed by its absence. As always, Miathkar. So I really wanted to just hammer that home. I think that even though we don't know what's unfolding around us a lot of the time, and a lot of information is occluded, it is the waters are muddied, things are withheld. Particularly, I have seen this firsthand with foreign policy. I don't know the motivations for people doing this. I can't mind read. I'm not suggesting we have a politics of mind reading. However, I can certainly articulate that. And hopefully, that is something that encourages people to participate in their environment, which includes community and political engagement. So hopefully, I'm quietly optimistic with this, really. And I think we're kind of getting, yes, sure, people have different motivations, which I cannot understand necessarily. But I think more and more people are particularly are having these conversations from my experience at grassroots levels of, hang on, something isn't right. We don't know what isn't right, but we are certainly trying to understand that a little bit better. So, anyway, I've put some links into the texts that I've referenced down in the space below. Please like, please comment. I will get back to you. And it's been great. I've been having some great conversations through comments, through emails, etc. And I'm really pleased that some people are engaging with the work that I'm doing. So I will be doing a blog next week, and hopefully it will not be raining so much. But anyway, as always, thanks very much. Have a great week. Bye.